Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm very happy to be back in Mukha Cafe. I came here, I think, about a year or so ago. The place seems to get more and more elaborate every time that I come, going from strength to strength, mashallah. And the crowd is always a very blessed one. One that inshallah makes up for the paucity of the speaker, but that's just my opinion. I thank all of you for coming out this evening. I know that it's a Friday night. You probably have far better things to do than come and listen to me. But I'm very pleased to see some faces I recognize in the crowd, some old friends, inshallah some new ones, to discuss a topic that I hope will be beneficial to you. It was certainly beneficial to me to research in order to write this text. And my thanks in particular to Mbara for helping to arrange this, Mukha Cafe for hosting it, Centra, if I can see Azrael somewhere in the crowd, yes, I see him, for assisting as well, in the Medina Institute, Jassan Johari. All of them went to a great deal of effort, and I know that it wasn't necessarily the easiest thing to do, considering that I arranged this, or I said that I was coming rather late. So thank you all to the organizers, and to all of you for coming. This evening is a launch event, as was said, for this particular book, A Sublime Way, the Sufi Path of the Sages of Mecca. I like to talk about this book by drawing your attention to a few particular points. The first is why I wrote the book, what drew me to the real leaders of this particular school. So and then perhaps a little bit about the book itself in terms of the tariqah and what it represents. So I have to say it's a very interesting story, at least for myself, because my understanding of this particular tariqah did not begin in Mecca. It actually began in Cape Town, in South Africa, where the... Okay, is that better? Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. Sayyid Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki rahmatullah alayh was indeed a great polymath and a great scholar of the Islamic sciences. Many know him by titles like Muhaddith al-Hijaz, the great master of hadith of the Hijaz, of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He taught in Mecca from a fairly young age, actually taking over from his father, Sayyid Ali ibn Maliki. But I never came across the tariqah in Mecca. I came across the tariqah actually in Cape Town when I first met Sheikh Siraj Hendricks and Sheikh Ahmed Hendricks, who were two of his khulafa. And South Africa had a particular resonance for me through my father. My father was a member of the anti-apartheid movement in the United Kingdom, and Cape Town was a place very close to all of us in that regard. So I found a great fascination with Cape Town and South Africa more generally. There was something in particular, though, about the Zawiya Masjid that I visited in Walmer State, which is at the base of Table Mountain in Cape Town, because the Muslims of Cape Town had a certain history. There were many Muslim communities in South Africa that had accepted the apartheid system for many reasons that I won't get into, but there were many who didn't. And you had people like Imam Abdullah Haroun and many other mashayikh of South Africa that were very opposed to this very oppressive system. And the system of apartheid, as I mentioned, was something that my father had agitated against as a young man. So that was what South Africa was to me. Sheikh Siraj may Allah give him long life and health, was somebody that I was quite attracted to before I actually met him, because of his writings on Islam, particularly in terms of tasawwuf, in terms of Sufism and Islamic law, and someone who struck me as being very cognizant of the needs of the age, and at the same time being very connected to the Turath, the tradition of Islam. But Allah works in the way that He works, and we benefit from the obstacles and the trials and the tribulations that we may go through. So that's how I came to Cape Town in that regard, and I have to say that that combination of that kind of resistance heritage was very appealing to me as a younger man, and still is today. And I think that's relevant to our situation today, because indeed, over the past, how long? MashaAllah, over the past decade, there's been this constant discussion around how much or how little Muslims ought to resist and be in a resistance kind of mode when it comes to oppression and repression around them. And I saw no such confusion when it came to the scholars of the Zawiya. They weren't partisans. They weren't people who who advocated joining this political party or that political party. They certainly weren't interested in power. But they also made no apologies for oppression. And they did not try to shirk from their responsibilities in that regard. And that was something I found and continue to find very important. The second point that I wanted to raise this evening relates actually to Sheikh Siraj's essay in the book. So the book is made up of several sections, and the first two sections are forewords by two scholars that I believe many of you are familiar with, Sheikh Afifuddin al-Jilani, Allah give him a long life, Ameen Ya Rabb, who I was blessed to do Hajj with, actually, almost 10 years ago. Actually, it was exactly 10 years ago, December this year. And Sheikh Muhammad Ninawi, who was kind enough to provide a foreword himself, as someone I've known for even longer than that. And following that, we have an essay by Sheikh Siraj that relates to pluralism within Islam and the necessity of recognizing difference and being away from partisanship of either a political or religious sense. And I found it a very interesting take, and I'm glad that that was the essay that he decided to write in the book. We live in a time where we seem to be quite incapable of disagreeing, except when we disagree very violently, very aggressively, very unkindly. And sometimes, I think people use the imperative towards adab as a way to get out of very difficult conversations. But that doesn't mean that because some people use that very lofty principle for a bad purpose, that it should simply be discarded. So I think that that's also very important to keep in mind. And he does it very well, mashallah, in the actual text. So I encourage those of you that are able to pay attention to that particular essay, especially somebody who is very committed to the Turath, but his vision of the Turath, of the tradition of this religion, is one that is very wide and very broad and very expansive. Whereas I think that we are used nowadays to viewing the tradition in a very essentialized, very monolithic, very small and very constrained kind of tradition. And that's not really the history of this religion. Another thing that was very important as we went around writing this was actually the process of writing it. So the way in which this began, and Sheikh Siraj mentions this in the book, was that I suggested to Sheikh Siraj that it might be useful to have a text that murids of the tariqah would be able to read and consult as almost like a handbook. Something brief, but something concise, something with a good taste of what the tariqah was about. And as we continued talking, eventually we found, through discussions amongst the three of us, and it was the three of us, it was Sheikh Saraj, Sheikh Ahmed, and both of them are Khulafa, Sayyid Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki, rahmatullah alayh, and myself. And before we knew it, mashallah, we had come up with almost a book draft. It wasn't quite the idea to begin with, if I'm honest. I thought we were doing something a lot more private than that. And we even thought about doing two versions, one that would be for public consumption and one private, with more explanation and so on, as more of a teaching text. This text, alhamdulillah, has been used for teaching. And it was, I have to say, a great pleasure, and I found personally very beneficial going through that process with Sheikh Saraj and Sheikh Ahmed, because it gave me the opportunity to ask certain questions and get certain answers and clarifications on things that I probably wouldn't have been able to in quite the same way if we hadn't engaged in this process of trying to write a particular text. And it reminded me, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to any of you, that books are very often an excuse, and that the real benefit that one finds is actually sitting with somebody to teach the text or the book. And very often the teaching is far more accurate than the actual book, right? So an old friend of mine went to study in Mauritania once, and he was reading from a very classical text in front of Sayyid Murabit al-Hajj, rahmatullah alayh. And at one point the student, my friend, read out a line, and Sayyid Murabit al-Hajj said, "Stop, that's wrong, this is the line." I said, "La ya Mawlana, yani it's here, like I see it's written as such." And he said, "Look, I took that text from my teachers, who took it from their teachers, who took it from their teachers, who took it back to the author in an unbroken chain. You took that text from a bookshop in Istanbul where it was printed by somebody, and you have no idea where that line comes from. So ignore your text and listen to me." So he did, and he then went to check the text, and indeed there was a typo. The printer had just made a mistake. But we forget those sorts of things. We forget that there are people in this ummah, even today, who, when we ask them questions, they will recite from memory, "Go to this book on this shelf in my library, page 4, paragraph 3, line 2, and that will be what it is." And we forget that. We forget that these people actually exist. They're far fewer today because of the way in which we do education, but they exist, and many more like them existed in the past. People wonder about Sahaba like Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, and wonder, how could he have memorized all of these ahadith? Because our memories are so flawed, and our memories are so weak. But actually it wasn't so extraordinary in his time, because that's the nature of how education was done, that people memorized tremendous amounts from a very, very young age. And any of you who are involved in education will know that from the age of, say, 2 until about 9, maybe 11, the way in which the brain functions is completely different from thereafter. So people can soak up languages in ways that they simply can't later on. Once you get past 12 years old, you'll never be native in a language, ever. You may be fluent, you may be completely fluent, but you'll never be native. It's because the brain changes after that point. You can become fluent. So any of you who are studying a language, don't feel disheartened. People have become fluent in very difficult languages when they start learning them at the age of 30, 40, 50 years old. But they won't become native, because nativity comes and begins at a very young age. And by the time of 12, maybe 15, it becomes very difficult to become native. And that's the same thing when it comes to memorization, that the skills that you develop just simply cease to be possible to change in a certain way. So I was taught that sort of reminder by engaging with our teachers on a text like this. The text itself begins with an explanation of the tariqah, which we call tariqah ulama Makka, okay, which means the way of the sages or of the scholars of Mecca. And it's a phrase that is used to describe this particular way, but it doesn't encompass everything about it. And what I mean by that is that at its root, and we go into this in the text, at its root, the tariqah is a Shadhili way, a way of the Shadhiliyya, which is a particular approach in tasawwuf, in Sufism, but it's encapsulated, and I'm trying to pick my words carefully here, but the book goes into it in much better detail, is encapsulated by a number of other things, particularly the Ba'alawi tariqah, particularly by the teachings of the Sayyid Ba'alawi. So Sayyid Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki, many think that he was from the Haba'ib, right? Because very often you see his name being mentioned and being cited, and also when you have these beautiful posters of old photos or paintings of old exponents of the Ba'alawiyya, you'll often find Sayyid Muhammad's portrait there. But Sayyid Muhammad wasn't Ba'alawi, in the sense that he wasn't from the Sada Ba'alawi. Sayyid Muhammad was actually of Hassani, Moroccan origin, and Idrisi in nasab and sanad, okay, in blood and in intellectual, or rather spiritual inheritance. And that comes through very much in the tariqah itself, that it's an Idrisi way, it's a Shadhili Idrisi way, but with a certain relationship that, again, goes into much better detail in the text with the Sada Ba'alawi. And it's an extraordinary thing to do research about, because the exponents of that particular way you'll find, of course, in Mecca, you'll of course find them in the Hijaz, but it's spread to different places as well. And as I said, I found it in South Africa, but there are other places around the world where you can find people who read from the books of the awrad of the tariqah, like Shawarik al-Anwar, the Mukha al-Ibada, okay, different texts that said Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki compiled, that brought together all of these different litanies. And those litanies are fascinating, because you'll see in a book, in the main book of awrad for the tariqah, you'll find Shadhili awrad, Ba'alawi awrad, Qadri awrad, Khalwati awrad, okay, and in the ijaza that said Muhammad bin Ali gave to his students and what they passed on to others if they were so authorized to do so, there'll be mentions of actually many turuq in the ijaza itself. It will mention the Shadhiliyya, it will mention the Naqshbandis, it will mention the Khalwatis, the Qadris. Something that I haven't found, I'm not saying it doesn't exist anywhere else, but I haven't found really anywhere else. This very regimented but eclectic kind of way of looking at the Turath. Particularly when it comes to tasawwuf, but Sayyid Muhammad was, of course, a great faqih and muhaddith and a great expert in the sciences. So we go into that in the text. We include some of the awrad at the end of the text. Not particularly many, because again, the text is, I shan't say it's more than an excuse to be with the teacher, but hopefully it gives people a sense of what this way was about, what it is about. I hope that you benefit from it if you do manage to get a copy. I didn't want to speak for very long, and the reason why I didn't want to speak for too long is that, alas, today I'm not able to be here particularly late. I need to be out that door by 9:30, and I wanted to speak less so that I can engage with you more, and I can hear your questions, your comments. I first ask your forgiveness for something, because I'm sure I sound completely A, monotonous, B, incoherent. And you're very kind. I have had probably about 4 hours of sleep on average in the last 2 days. I'm surviving on coffee. because I've traveled quite a long distance and I haven't quite adjusted to the jet lag. So, one, forgive me. Two, go easy on me, please. Before I wrap up, again, I want to thank Mukha Cafe for hosting us this evening, to Azrio from Centra, to Ambara, to Medina Institute, and to all of you for making the time to come out this evening and for tolerating my words. I will be hanging around a little bit longer, so please, if there's anything that I misspoke or wasn't clear, let me know. I'm afraid I won't be in Malaysia for very long. I leave in a few days. But if anybody wishes to contact me, just let me know. I'm here, and I look forward to having a chance at least to meet you a little bit this evening. I believe Medina Institute might be holding something in a few days. I'm afraid that's all I know of. But again, I thank you all for coming this evening. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.